Welcome to Journey to Justice. I'm Eiko Kosasa, your host. Today my guest, Kat Brady, needs no introduction when it comes to advocacy for better prison conditions and prisoner rights. Kat coordinates the Community Alliance on Prisons. She hosts her own community TV program called Hawai'i Justice on the first Tuesday of each month at 8:30 p.m. on Channel 54 on Oahu. I began the interview by asking her where she was born and raised.
I was born in the Ahupua'a of New York City, in the Ili of the Bronx, and pretty much stayed there until I was about 30, and then moved to Westchester County.
Okay.
A little north of New York City.
Yeah. So how did you come to political consciousness? Was it something that, like an event happened, or did things come in as you were growing up, parents, or?
Well, my parents, my mom particularly, was politically active in the community. Mm-hmm. And I probably was in my first protest when I was 3, because there was one block where, one corner where a lot of kids were hit by cars. And my mom had been to city council and talked to every elected official to try to get a traffic light on that corner, and was really reaching a dead end where people were sympathetic but doing nothing. So she organized something called the Baby Carriage Brigade, because most of the ladies in the neighborhood were young moms like my mom. And we basically, and I remember my sister was in a carriage and I was holding on to the carriage, and we blocked traffic for about 8 hours. And it still took 20 years to get a traffic light, but finally got a traffic light there. And that really taught me that if you want something done, you gather people together and you keep raising the issue, and you never, ever give up, because it took a long time, but it did happen. So I realized that justice is not an immediate, instant gratification thing. It's something that you work at, and that when you really believe in something, you never, ever give up.
Wow, that's amazing. And getting a traffic light, that's not even controversial, I mean, supposedly, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a big political issue yet.
Yeah.
There was so much
And it was
resistance.
the 50s. So it was really kind of strange that it took so much energy to make that happen, when, you know, every community says how much they care about kids. Yeah. And yet, you know, all these kids were being hit by cars, and everybody knew it, but just the political will wasn't there.
Yeah.
And that was sort of my first kind of foray into, you got to organize to get something done.
So would you say your mother was a big influence?
Yes, yes. She raised, I'm one of 5 kids, and she raised us all to believe that your job is to make the world better than you found it. And you know, it's not a right to do stuff, it's a responsibility to make the world better. And all of us, I think, really embrace that, and all of us do something.
Yeah.
So,
wow.
Yeah, she was a huge influence, and a huge influence in the community. She was little, around my size, like 5'2", and, you know, thin. But she was a powerhouse, because she never, ever gave up. So I remember growing up and, you know, licking stamps and envelopes for political campaigns, for all sorts of things. And ideologically, my mom and I disagreed on several issues. Yet we always found a way to discuss, and there were some things that we just realized we were never going to agree on, so we just avoided those topics.
Well, those are good lessons, in a way, of how you deal with people.
Yes, right? Yes.
Wow.
Because you don't always want to be talking to the choir.
Yeah,
you always,
exactly.
You know, when you're politically active, and when you really are passionate about an issue, you want to know what the other side is saying. You want to know what their objections are. so that you can counter those objections with reasonable, humane responses. And that's pretty much how I've led my entire life. Was sort of the smallest kid in the neighborhood and always organizing everybody, and and realizing that you're going to encounter people who, some people will disagree, some people will vehemently disagree, and how do you deal with that? And I guess instead of trying to always talk to the choir, I'm always trying to cross the street and try to figure out what's going on and what motivates people to certain opinions.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. That is from an experience point of view, because usually people want to speak to like-minded people, but if you really want to make change, you do have to talk to the people who are kind of running the show.
It's interesting. I have a sister my younger sister was living in the Midwest, and I went to stay with her for about a week when she was living in a small town in Kansas. And after about 5 days, I only saw people who looked like me. Blonde hair, blue eye. Finally, I just said, you know what? I know that there are other people here, and I need to see them. And my brother-in-law said, well, there's a section of town where, a lot of the black people are. I said, well, of course, this is Kansas City, the birth of the blues. I need to go there. And I made him take me to that part of town where there were jazz clubs and rib joints and really wonderful people. And I remember walking into a restaurant where I was the only white person. And when I walked in, all conversation stopped. And I just said, hi, how's everybody doing today? And people were like stunned.
Who's this lady?
And I ordered probably the best ribs. At that time I ate meat I ever ate in my whole life.
Wow.
And, I brought them home to the rest of the family and said, this is what you're missing. Life is full of such texture and color. And by living in a place where everybody thinks like you, looks like you, you're really missing out on the whole texture of life. And you need to open up. You need to talk to people who are different, who think differently, and really learn from those experiences.
Is that what kind of brought you to Hawaii?
No, actually, I've been reading about Hawaii since I've been about 10. And I just always knew that I was going to be here. I was always attracted by the culture, by the multicultural society here. And that's one thing that I feel really lucky to be born and raised in New York City. Oh, yeah. Where, you can walk down Broadway and hear 10 different languages within 2 blocks, 5 of which you never heard before. And, people look different, they act different, and, it's exciting.
Yeah.
So I've always been really interested in the art world and texture and things like that, fabrics that sort of compete with each other. Colors that, people say, oh, they could never go together, but they really contrast.
Yeah.
I've always sort of been really enamored of that. And so in reading about Hawaii and reading about Hawaiian culture, I really didn't have, growing up in New York, experience with Hawaii. But I knew a lot of people from different islands around the world, people from different islands in Africa, different countries in Africa, and a lot of people, island people from the Caribbean. But I didn't really know much about Hawaii. I didn't know many people, only what I had read. But I was really taken with the hospitality of the Hawaiian people. And I thought, I really want to go there and meet these incredible people. And it took me a long time to get here. I thought that I would retire here. And then in the 80s, I developed cancer, and my best friend died at 34. And I thought, you know what, I'm not waiting. I'm going now. So I moved here not knowing anyone, not having a job, nothing. And just packed up, left, came, and within 3 days just fell in love with the people.
Wow.
Just people friendly, some people not so friendly, but that didn't bother me because, you know, people are people.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I really feel grateful every day. I don't think, I've been here almost 30 years, and I don't think I've woken up one day without saying, I am so lucky to live in a place where people are just full of love and kindness. And, you know, it's kind of different. I know a lot of West Indian people, and their culture is kind of interesting, where they sort of sit on the sidelines and watch you. And if they feel like you're a good person, they'll accept you into their family. And not only you, but everybody you know. So you know, when I was in Jamaica in the 70s, people were actually inviting me into their homes. And, you know, it was just, they watch you and then they figure out, oh, she's okay. Where in Hawaii, people are just so open, you know, oh, Ellie Mai, come in, have some food, then we'll talk. You know, very different than the West Indian culture, but just as genuine and kind and loving. And I just feel very grateful to be here every day, and I've tried to contribute to the community.
Yeah, you've dedicated your life to change and making it a better place. I know you're involved in the women's issues, the Hawaiian independence, but today I want to talk about prison issues, because when anybody does any kind of report or something about the prison issues, they always interview Cat Brady. And so I'd like to know first how it came to that.
Well, I'm an environmentalist.
Oh, that's
Actually,
right.
my partner and I run Life of the Land, which is a 43-year-old environmental and community action group. And around the 90s, around the early to mid-90s, I was trying to figure out, where is all the money going? In the 80s, we had plenty of money.
That's right.
And in the 90s, all of a sudden, we had no money. So I went down to the budget office and I got these 3 big red budget books, and I brought them home. And of course, everything is in code, right? Every agency has a code, every division within the agency has a code, and every program within every division within the agency has a code. Yeah. So once you crack the code, you can kind of figure out, you know, what's happening. So it was like, how do I crack the code? Okay, they go before the legislature and they do informational briefings before the session. And in order to do those briefings, they reveal the codes. So, that was my first thing. You find that information, you figure out what the codes are, and then you can sort of read the budget because you've cracked the code.
Yeah.
So for me, that was a big step in my own understanding of how things work, because I really believe the budget is a moral document. You know, they can make any kind of policy which sounds really good and, you know, caring about people. The budget is where the rubber meets the road. That is what they do. So how people spend their money is a lot more revealing than what they say. So
I like how you said that it's really a moral
It is.
issue.
It really is, because that's how they're spending tax dollars.
Yeah.
So I realized after cracking the code and looking at the budget that one budget in the state that's constantly rising is the Department of Public Safety. And then my next quest was, well, who's in prison and how come? And, you know, the answer therein was nonviolent drug offenders. So then you follow that thread, and it all leads back to the Nixon war on drugs. And that's when budgets just started skyrocketing for law enforcement and prisons. And what are we doing? And I started testifying, and for about the first 7 to 10 years, it was me and the prosecutor, and obviously we were not on the same side. And they never cited research. They would use, the most heinous crime, and in most cases they were crimes from other places, not even from Hawaii, to push really punitive, sentencing laws. And I thought, what are we doing? This is not even about us.
Yeah.
So then I really, I've always been interested in research. I'm sort of a nerd in that way, that I always have been interested in how things work and why things happen the way they do. And research is very revealing because it's independent, and it's people who, and I only am interested in independent research. I'm not interested in research that private prisons paid for.
Right.
Because they're basically, they hire people and tell them what the outcome's going to be, and then ask them to
justify.
Yeah. Yeah. So for me, scholarly research is really important. And I have, I've used research my whole career in justice. One of the first things I tried to figure out was, why do we have so many women in prison? And most of them are moms. And how is this helpful when we have nonviolent women who are locked up for, 3.5 to 5 years for selling a $40 bag of something? And I just think, if drugs are the problem, why aren't we dealing with that? And why do we think that locking people up where you can get drugs is going to be helpful?
Yeah.
So, all of this stuff just has escalated my interest. And around 2009, I wrote a research paper called Smart Justice. And, I looked into how our prison system has grown. And from 2000 to 2010, the budget for public safety increased 90%.
Wow.
And the budget for out-of-state prisons increased 221%. And I thought, something is so wrong. And, currently we banish about 1,600 people to 2 corporate prisons in Arizona. And, that's, the people like to say, oh, it's much cheaper than in Hawaii. But, it's a lot more than economic costs. It is really ripping apart families, communities, and we're all paying a huge, huge price for that. So these are the things that really motivate me, things that I love my community, and I love the people of Hawaii, and none of us is, everybody has done something they haven't been proud of, but not everybody goes to prison for that. And I guess the Wall Street crash in 2008 was pretty revealing to me.
Yeah.
I mean, there's an example of people who harmed not only, individuals, they harmed families, communities, the world economy.
Yeah.
And yet who's gone to prison for that? And yet we're locking up people who have drug problems, for selling $40 bags. And we're paying and the taxpayers are paying $46,255 a year to do that. Why? It makes no economic sense.
Yeah.
So, when you look at that, and I'm not an economist, but I can read, and I know how to balance my checkbook. And I know that what we're doing is definitely not sustainable. And why are we so into this punishment mode rather than directly dealing with the things that cause people to end up incarcerated?
Yeah, and would be profits, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and job security.
Security.
It's a huge, and the whole war on drugs has inflated law enforcement. I have a big list that I send articles out on, and I sent out something recently that showed the evolution of the police department around the nation. It's the militarization. They used to be. I had a friend who was the police chief on the Big Island and many, many decades ago. And he said to me, "You know what they used to call us, Kat?" And I said, "No." He said, "Peace officers."
Oh.
And, when I looked at this visual that I saw in an article, it showed sort of like, the beat cops that we all kind of knew and everybody
Yeah.
would know Officer Joe or whatever.
Yeah.
To, somebody who looks like a member of a SWAT team. And that's,
Yeah.
that's where we've come. And to me, that is a terrible social indictment,
Yeah.
Yeah. And yet, how do you take that money away from law enforcement when their budgets have been totally inflated by the war on drugs?
Yeah.
There's a group called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, and it's ex-police officers or even current police officers, judges, prosecutors. It's huge. It's a national group. And I was speaking with the man who started that, who was a vice cop from New Jersey in the 70s. And I asked him, "What made you do this?" And he said, "After I retired, I could not sleep. I ruined so many lives that I could not sleep." And I realized that we're just going down this path that is foreclosing the future of all these people. And what do we think the effect is going to be? He said, "When I was a vice cop in New Jersey, there were 7 cops in the vice squad, and we had about $1 million a year budget." He said, "Nixon started the war on drugs. In 1 year, we had 70 vice cops and a multi-million-dollar budget."
Wow.
And I thought to myself, wow, how do you rest? How do you do that? It's like, they're used to that money.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like the war on marijuana now. I mean, marijuana is pretty, benign.
Yeah.
And in the 70s, on the Big Island, they had a thriving economy.
Yeah.
And, now they have green harvest and, you look at that kind of stuff and you say, where's the reasonableness in this?
Yeah.
It's like, shouldn't law enforcement be putting their money toward violent crime? Things that really...
Yeah.
Prison is made for people who are violent and antisocial, who can't function in a social system. And, perhaps, I'm not even sure prison's the right place for that. I think we need to do something when people need to be separated from the community, but you don't lock violent people up in a violent place and think they're not going to be violent. Just like you don't put a nonviolent person in a violent place and think they're going to remain nonviolent. It's like you have to do things when you're in prison that maybe you would never do in the community, but you protect yourself.
Yeah.
And why do we do that? So I guess I was born kind of asking this question, why? I don't understand why this is happening. And all of that just keeps me doing more and more research to try to figure out what is going on.
Does it ever feel overwhelming? I mean, you could see all the different levels and layers, with just the language, like the war on drugs, and then so the larger society starts thinking this is bad, and they're thinking of people in a very negative way.
Yes.
Instead of, oh no, we're all part of a community. People are having these problems. Why, right? Like you're asking.
Yeah.
But do you ever feel overwhelmed because it's a big ball?
Yes. Yes, I do. And sometimes I think, wow, I barely make enough to live on. And I think I could just get a job and, go home at 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
And then, the phone rings and it's a weeping mom or a weeping dad or somebody from prison. And I think, if not me, who? And if not now, when? And it's not that I'm so great. Believe me, we need thousands of people speaking out. We need the community to stand up and say what we're doing is just putting us further down the rabbit hole. But right now, I guess I sort of play a role that's the buffer between the system and the person who's caught in the web. And, their families they're not the ones incarcerated, but they're invisibly incarcerated. And I can tell you, I've been a community organizer for about 50 years. This is the hardest organizing I have ever done in my life because there is so much shame attached to this. Families don't want to step forward. Legislators have come to me and told me confidentially that they have family members in prison, but they would never say that out loud. So it's an issue that has so much shame attached to it that I feel there needs to be someone who is going to speak out and who's going to speak truth to power. I'm not willing to sit on the sidelines and watch my community be decimated by other people who like to slice and dice society, bad, good. The one thing my mom raised me to say is the world is not really black and white. It's mostly gray. It's mostly gray. And I think, there's very few things that you can that are that clear. And every crime has a set of circumstances.
Yeah.
Every person has, a background that that they come from. And when we start doing things like setting mandatory minimums or 3 strikes laws, what we're saying is we don't care who you are. We don't care. We're going to just decide that you do this, that's what you get. And, my first reaction to that was, why do we have a judiciary then? Judges are there to look at the, circumstances of a crime, the person who's before their bench, and make a reasoned decision about what the penalty should be for that crime. And yet what we have is this disproportionate, the sentences that we levy are disproportionate to the crime. I was working with a woman who went back to prison for a parole violation for selling a $40 bag of something and got a 10-year sentence. And I'm thinking, oh my God, people who murder get out before that.
Yeah.
Something is so wrong, and we're paying for that.
Yeah.
So, it's like we have a theft statute that anything over $300, so if you steal $301 worth of something, you can go to prison for 5 years. And I'm thinking, okay, so even if you go for 1 year, you steal $301 worth of something, and the taxpayer gets dinged for $46,255
a year. Yeah, for 3.
That's for 1 year. That's totally disproportionate.